Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling incidents ever documented in the remote high country of the Colorado Territory. Before we proceed, I encourage you to share in the comments section your current location and the precise moment you're hearing this account. We're genuinely curious to learn where and at what hours of the day or night these chronicled occurrences reach new listeners. The winter of 1893 descended with particular ferocity upon the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, keeping the passes snowbound well into late April. It was during this period of profound isolation that inhabitants of the Crestone Valley began to notice something distinctly odd about the pelt deliveries made by Zachariah Whitmore, a fur trader who had established himself in their midst the previous autumn. According to the detailed parish records maintained by Father Cornelius Ashford at the Modest Catholic Mission, Whitmore had first appeared in October of 1892. He claimed to represent a collective of trappers working the remote high country. Described as a tall, gaunt figure with prematurely silvered hair, his hands bore unusual scarring that witnesses noted appeared almost ritualistic in its precision and symmetry. The priest, in his weekly correspondence with the diocese, documented that Whitmore was reticent about his background, offering only that he had previously worked territories further north where the wildlife, as he put it, runs different. At that time, the Crestone Valley settlement comprised roughly 30 adult souls, primarily miners, married couples, and a handful of merchants who supplied the numerous claims scattered across the mountainsides. The small community had coalesced around a natural spring and the modest shelter provided by a narrow canyon, which offered a degree of protection from the relentless mountain winds. Most residents resided in simple log structures, with the more prosperous families occupying two-room cabins equipped with stone fireplaces. The valley itself had been formed centuries prior by glacial action, creating a natural amphitheater encircled by towering peaks. The Ute tribes had long regarded this area as significant, referencing it in their oral traditions as a location where the earth speaks to those who listen properly. These indigenous accounts, recorded sporadically by territorial surveyor Nathaniel Crawford during his 1891 expedition, described the valley as a place where spirits from the deep places could communicate with the surface world. Crawford's geological survey had identified several cave systems within the surrounding cliffs, though the harsh climate and treacherous terrain had prevented any thorough exploration. His notes, preserved in territorial archives, mentioned unusual acoustic properties in certain caves, properties that seemed to amplify and carry sounds in ways that defied normal acoustic principles. Local Ute guides had steadfastly refused to enter these cave systems, claiming they were places of calling that could trap the unwary. The surveyor's documentation included detailed sketches of cave entrances featuring geometric patterns carved directly into the surrounding rock. These carvings appeared ancient, predating any known historical presence in the area, yet displayed a precision suggesting a sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles. Crawford noted that similar patterns appeared throughout the cave systems, invariably positioned to be immediately visible to anyone entering the passages. Whitmore established his trading operation in an abandoned prospector's cabin at the mouth of Dead Horse Canyon, approximately 2 miles from the main settlement. The location struck many as peculiar, given its isolation and the fact that previous attempts to utilize the site had ended in failure. The cabin had been constructed in 1889 by Jeremiah Slocum, a prospector who had abandoned it after reporting persistent disturbances that rendered sleep impossible. Slocum's departure had been abrupt, leaving behind tools, supplies, and personal belongings that suggested no intention of permanent abandonment. When questioned by other prospectors about his hasty exit, Slocum claimed he had discovered signs of previous habitation in nearby caves, including arrangements of human bones and symbols carved deep into the living rock. He insisted that staying longer would have meant accepting an invitation he wasn't prepared to answer. The cabin's interior bore evidence of Slocum's disturbing final weeks. Carved into the wooden walls were geometric patterns resembling no known indigenous designs. These carvings appeared to have been executed with desperate urgency, often overlapping and intersecting in ways that created optical illusions when viewed by lamplight. Slocum had also covered every window with multiple layers of boards, creating an environment of perpetual darkness even during daylight hours. The patterns carved by Slocum showed remarkable similarity to those documented by Crawford in the cave systems, suggesting either that the prospector had discovered and copied the ancient designs, or that the same influence responsible for the cave markings had affected his behavior during his final weeks in the cabin. The precision and mathematical complexity of the carvings seemed inconsistent with the work of a mentally disturbed individual. Yet their desperate execution suggested extreme psychological distress. When Whitmore took possession of the cabin, he made few modifications to Slocum's arrangements. He removed the window coverings but left the wall carvings intact, claiming they added character to the space. Visitors to his trading post noted that the patterns seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally, though direct examination revealed only static carved lines. The hide trader's first deliveries were unremarkable. He provided quality deer, elk, and mountain sheep pelts to the valley's residents, who used them for winter clothing, bedding, and trade with supply wagons that occasionally made the treacherous journey up from the Colorado plains. His prices were fair, and his goods appeared to be of exceptional quality. Several couples, including the Kesslers who ran the general store, noted that Whitmore's hides seemed unusually well preserved and bore a distinctive, almost sweet odor that lingered long after the transaction. Evangeline Kessler, wife of the store owner, maintained a detailed household ledger that survived the decades and was eventually donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1961. Her entries from November 1892 provide insight into the community's initial impressions of their new trader. She wrote, "Mr. Whitmore delivered 6 deer hides today. Rupert was pleased with the quality, though I remarked that the fur felt different somehow, softer than what we typically see from local hunters. The hide seems almost warm to the touch, as though it retains some vestige of the animal's life force." Evangeline's observations proved more perceptive than anyone initially realized. Her detailed descriptions of Whitmore's early deliveries noted subtle inconsistencies that would later prove significant. She recorded variations in fur patterns that didn't match seasonal expectations, hide dimensions that exceeded normal proportions for the claimed species, and preservation techniques that left the pelts unusually pliable despite apparent age. The woman's scientific curiosity, unusual for frontier wives of that era, led her to begin a personal collection of hair and fur samples from Whitmore's deliveries, pressing them between pages of her personal journal, along with detailed notes about their characteristics. This collection would later provide crucial evidence for investigators attempting to understand the true nature of Whitmore's trade goods. As winter deepened, Whitmore's visits became more frequent, often arriving during snowstorms that would have made travel extremely dangerous for most men. He always came alone, leading a pack horse loaded with carefully wrapped bundles. Residents noticed that despite the harsh weather, he never appeared tired or cold, and his horse always seemed well fed, even when local livestock were struggling with scarce fodder. The trader's apparent immunity to cold weather became a topic of frequent discussion among valley residents. Temperatures during the winter of 1892 to 93 regularly dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet Whitmore traveled mountain passes wearing only standard wool clothing. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, showed none of the signs of stress typically exhibited by animals subjected to extreme cold exposure. Dr. Theron Thorne, the valley's only physician, began keeping informal notes about Whitmore's visits after observing several peculiarities. The doctor, who had received his medical training at Johns Hopkins before seeking his fortune in the Colorado Territory, possessed a scientific mind that found certain aspects of the hide trader's business troubling. His medical practice in more civilized areas had included treating numerous cases of frostbite, exposure, and cold-related injuries, making him particularly qualified to recognize the anomalies in Whitmore's apparent cold resistance. In December 1892, Dr. Thorne wrote to a former colleague, "I have encountered a most curious individual here in our mountain settlement. His wares are of extraordinary quality, yet I cannot identify the source of several hides he has provided. The fur patterns and coloring do not match any indigenous species with which I am familiar, despite 20 years of hunting and specimen collection throughout the Rocky Mountain region. More puzzling is his apparent immunity to weather conditions that severely tax even the most experienced mountain men." The doctor's medical training included significant study of comparative anatomy, making his inability to identify certain species particularly troubling. During his years in Colorado, Dr. Thorne had built an extensive collection of specimens from local wildlife, systematically cataloging the variations in fur patterns, bone structures, and other identifying characteristics. His expertise was recognized by the Territorial Naturalist Society, which regularly requested his assistance in classifying unusual specimens. When Dr. Thorne examined Whitmore's hides using his standard classification methods, he found characteristics that seemed to combine features from multiple species in ways that should not have been possible through natural means. Fur density patterns suggested Arctic adaptation, yet color variations indicated temperate climate evolution. Bone attachment points visible on the hide edges corresponded to skeletal structures he could not match to any known North American mammals. The first truly unsettling incident occurred in January 1893 when Josiah Brennan, a veteran hunter who had worked the Colorado mountains since the 1860s, examined several of Whitmore's recent deliveries at the Kessler store. Brennan possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife, having served as a guide for numerous scientific expeditions, including the Wheeler Survey of 1875 and the Powell Geographic Expedition of 1870. His expertise was so well regarded that territorial officials regularly consulted him on matters related to wildlife management and resource assessment. Brennan's examination of Whitmore's hides revealed inconsistencies that troubled him deeply. He had personally tracked, killed, and processed hundreds of animals throughout his career, developing an almost instinctive understanding of how different species' hides should look, feel, and smell. The hides provided by Whitmore violated several fundamental principles of his accumulated knowledge. According to Evangeline Kessler's ledger, Brennan told her, "Ma'am, I've seen every creature that walks, crawls, or flies in these mountains. And I can tell you with certainty that some of these pelts ain't from anything that belongs here. That white one with the blue undertones, the trader claims it's from an albino deer. But the fur patterns are all wrong. Albino deer keep their normal fur structure, just lose the pigmentation. This hide shows fur growth patterns I've never seen, like it was adapted for conditions that don't exist in Colorado." Brennan's concerns extended beyond simple species identification. His experienced eye detected signs of processing techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than anything available in frontier settlements. The hides showed evidence of preservation methods that left them remarkably supple and fresh-smelling despite apparent age. Traditional smoking, salt curing, or brain tanning processes could not have achieved similar results. The veteran hunter also noticed that several hides appeared to have been modified after the initial processing. Careful examination revealed almost invisible seams where pieces from different animals had been joined together. These modifications were executed with such skill that they were nearly undetectable, requiring close inspection under good lighting to identify. The purpose of such modifications remained unclear, but the level of craftsmanship suggested involvement by individuals with specialized training. When Evangeline relayed Brennan's concerns to her husband, they decided to question Whitmore directly during his next visit. However, the trader's responses only deepened the mystery. He claimed his hides came from various elevations, including areas beyond the treeline where creatures adapt differently to the conditions. When pressed for specific locations, he provided vague references to high valleys and hidden basins that none of the local hunters recognized. Whitmore's explanations were delivered with confident authority, but they contained geographical references that made no sense to residents who had spent years exploring the surrounding mountains. He mentioned valleys that supposedly existed above the cloud line where animals had developed unique adaptations to extreme altitude. Such descriptions contradicted basic biological principles, as higher elevations generally supported less diverse wildlife populations, not more specialized ones. The trader also claimed to work with indigenous hunting guides who possessed traditional knowledge passed down through generations. He described techniques for tracking animals in terrain that other hunters considered impassable and methods for preserving hides that produced superior results compared to European-derived processes. However, when local residents attempted to verify these claims with Ute tribal members who occasionally traded in the valley, they found no knowledge of such techniques or individuals. The situation grew more peculiar when several couples reported unusual dreams after acquiring Whitmore's hides. Ingrid Kessler, Evangeline's sister-in-law, noted in letters to relatives in Denver that she had begun experiencing vivid nightmares after using one of Whitmore's deer hides as a bed covering. She described dreams of being watched by eyes that seemed to follow her through dark forests, and of hearing whispers in languages she didn't recognize. The dreams reported by Ingrid Kessler possessed unusual clarity and consistency. Unlike typical nightmares that fade upon awakening, these visions remained vivid throughout the day, often feeling more real than actual memories. She described walking through underground passages carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. The passages led to vast chambers where groups of people engaged in activities she could observe but not understand. Most disturbing were the voices in these dreams. Ingrid reported hearing conversations in what sounded like multiple languages, though she could understand fragments despite having no knowledge of any language other than English and basic German. The conversations seemed to concern preparations for some unspecified event, with references to surface dwellers and completion of the arrangement. Similar reports emerged from other families. The Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who had purchased bear hides for their cabin walls, complained of persistent scratching sounds within their walls that only occurred at night. These sounds followed no pattern that would suggest rodent or insect infestation, instead occurring in rhythmic sequences that seemed almost communicative in nature. The Henderson couple's experiences escalated beyond simple auditory disturbances. Martha Henderson reported finding small objects in their cabin that she couldn't remember acquiring: carved bone items, unusual stones, and what appeared to be primitive tools made from unfamiliar materials. These objects appeared overnight, always in locations where they would be immediately noticed, as though deliberately placed for discovery. John Henderson attempted to track the source of these mysterious additions to their household. He began sleeping in shifts with his wife, ensuring that someone remained awake throughout each night. However, the objects continued to appear even during periods of constant vigilance. On one occasion, a carved wooden item appeared on their dining table while John sat reading less than 6 feet away. He reported noticing the object immediately upon its appearance, yet could not recall any movement or sound that might have indicated how it arrived. The Olsons, an elderly couple who ran a small blacksmith operation, reported that their livestock began displaying unusual behavior after they acquired rabbit fur blankets from Whitmore's stock. Their horses and cattle showed signs of distress whenever brought near the blankets, refusing to enter areas where the materials had been placed. Dr. Thorne's examination found no medical explanation for the animals' reactions, leading him to suspect that the hides possessed some property that affected sensitive creatures in ways humans couldn't immediately perceive. Dr. Thorne attempted a more systematic investigation, requesting permission to examine several of Whitmore's hides in detail. The trader initially resisted, claiming trade secrets, but eventually allowed the doctor to study 3 specimens under controlled conditions. Thorne's findings, preserved in his medical journal, were deeply troubling. Upon microscopic examination, he wrote, the first samples display cellular structures that are inconsistent with known North American mammals. The hair follicle patterns suggest adaptation to extreme conditions, yet not those found at our elevation or climate. Most disturbing is the presence of what appears to be scarring in the hide tissue, forming regular patterns that suggest intentional modification rather than natural growth or injury. Dr. Thorne's medical training included significant exposure to pathology and anatomical studies, making his observations particularly credible. His microscopic examination revealed cellular structures that appeared to combine characteristics from multiple species in ways that defied normal biological development. Hair shaft compositions showed mineral content that didn't match any known regional environmental conditions. The scarring patterns discovered by Dr. Thorne followed geometric designs that appeared throughout Whitmore's operation. These weren't random injury marks or natural blemishes, but deliberate modifications that had been made while the animals were alive, then allowed to heal before harvesting. The precision and consistency of these patterns suggested a systematic approach that required considerable knowledge of animal physiology and healing processes. When Dr. Thorne shared his findings with Father Ashford, the priest became increasingly concerned about Whitmore's presence in their community. The priest began maintaining his own observations, noting in his correspondence with the diocese that several parishioners had reported feeling spiritually uneasy after contact with the trader's goods. Father Ashford's educational background included seminary training in theology and philosophy, but also substantial study of natural history and scientific methodology. The Catholic Church's traditional emphasis on rational investigation of natural phenomena had prepared him to evaluate claims of unusual occurrences with both skepticism and thoroughness. His growing concern about Whitmore reflected careful observation rather than superstitious fear. The priest's letters to diocesan authorities, discovered in church archives in 1954, revealed his systematic approach to documenting the unusual experiences reported by his parishioners. He conducted detailed interviews with affected families, cross-referencing their accounts to identify common elements and eliminate purely subjective interpretations. His findings showed consistent patterns that suggested external causation rather than mass hysteria or suggestion. Father Ashford wrote, "I have counseled several families who report distressing experiences following their commerce with this Whitmore fellow. While I am hesitant to attribute supernatural causes to mundane events, I cannot ignore the consistent nature of these reports. The affected individuals describe experiences that share remarkable similarities despite having no opportunity for collaboration or mutual influence. These include dreams featuring identical geographical locations, auditory phenomena occurring at consistent times, and physical sensations that follow predictable patterns. The priest's concerns intensified when he noticed that Whitmore never attended church services despite the strong religious observance that characterized most frontier communities. When Father Ashford approached him about attending Mass, Whitmore politely declined, stating that he followed older practices that predated Christianity in the region. Whitmore's reference to older practices intrigued Father Ashford, who possessed considerable knowledge of indigenous spiritual traditions throughout the Rocky Mountain region. During his seminary studies, he had written extensive papers on the relationship between Christian doctrine and existing native belief systems, developing expertise in comparative religious practices that few frontier priests possessed. When Father Ashford attempted to engage Whitmore in discussions about these older practices, the trader proved evasive but knowledgeable. He demonstrated familiarity with Ute spiritual concepts, particularly those related to underground spaces and communication with subterranean entities. However, his knowledge extended beyond any single tribal tradition, incorporating elements from multiple indigenous cultures in ways that suggested either extensive travel or access to sources of information unavailable to most frontier traders. As February turned to March, Whitmore's visits became increasingly frequent, sometimes occurring weekly instead of monthly. His pack horse carried larger loads, and the variety of hides expanded to include species that none of the local hunters could identify. One particular hide, which he described as coming from a mountain cat, measured nearly 8 feet in length and displayed a striped pattern unlike any known feline species in North America. The increase in Whitmore's deliveries coincided with observable changes in his personal behavior. Residents noted that he seemed more focused and purposeful during his visits, spending less time on casual conversation and more time examining potential customers with an intensity that made many uncomfortable. His interactions became increasingly transaction-oriented, as though he was working toward some deadline that required efficient completion of his business. Evangeline Kessler documented these behavioral changes in her household ledger, noting that Whitmore's conversations had shifted from general topics to specific questions about family structures, individual health conditions, and personal preferences regarding various hide types. His inquiries seemed designed to gather detailed information about community members rather than simply facilitate commerce. The exotic hides provided during this period showed characteristics that challenged even Dr. Thorne's scientific understanding. The alleged mountain cat hide displayed fur patterns that seemed to shift under different lighting conditions, creating optical effects that made accurate examination difficult. Chemical tests revealed mineral compositions that didn't match any known regional geological formations. Josiah Brennan's growing suspicions led him to attempt following Whitmore on one of his departure trips from the valley. The hunter waited until Whitmore completed his rounds and began heading back toward Dead Horse Canyon, then followed at a distance using tracking skills developed over decades of wilderness experience. Brennan's pursuit required considerable expertise, as Whitmore seemed aware of potential surveillance and took precautions to avoid leaving clear tracks. The trader's route through the mountain terrain followed paths that seemed deliberately chosen to minimize visibility and maximize confusion for anyone attempting to follow. He utilized natural terrain features to break up his trail and employed techniques that suggested professional training in counter-surveillance methods. According to Brennan's account, recorded years later by a territorial marshal investigating unrelated matters, Whitmore's route took him not toward the high country, as expected, but deeper into the canyon system. The trader followed game trails that led through narrow defile and across exposed rock faces where footprints would be impossible to track. "I followed him for about 3 miles, Brennan reported, until the canyon walls got too narrow and steep for safe passage in the snow. But before I turned back, I heard something that stopped me cold. It wasn't human voices, but it wasn't animal sounds either. It was like singing, but with words in no language I'd ever heard. The rhythm was regular, like a work song, but the pitch rose and fell in ways that hurt to listen to. And there was a smell carrying on the wind, sweet but wrong, like flowers that had been dead too long, but somehow still growing." Brennan's description of the sounds emanating from the deeper canyon matched reports from other residents who had ventured near the area during Whitmore's visits. The vocalization seemed to serve some coordinating function, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication rather than random noise. The acoustic properties of the canyon walls amplified and carried these sounds in ways that made their exact source impossible to determine. The smell described by Brennan proved to be another consistent element in various accounts. Multiple witnesses reported detecting an odor that combined floral sweetness with something organic and decaying. The smell seemed strongest during Whitmore's absences, suggesting that whatever produced it remained active in the canyon even when the trader was not present. Brennan's investigation attempt marked a turning point in the community's relationship with Whitmore. Word of the hunter's experience spread quickly through the small settlement, creating an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Several couples began refusing Whitmore's goods, claiming they no longer needed additional hides despite the ongoing harsh weather. The community's growing reluctance to deal with Whitmore created practical problems, as his hides had become an important resource for surviving the harsh mountain winter. Alternative sources of processed hides required dangerous journeys to distant settlements, and the quality of available substitutes was significantly inferior to Whitmore's products. This created a dilemma for families who needed the materials but feared the consequences of continued association with the trader. Dr. Thorne decided to conduct his own investigation. Approaching the matter with scientific methodology, he began keeping detailed records of everyone who had purchased Whitmore's hides, noting any subsequent health complaints or unusual experiences. His findings, compiled over several weeks, showed a clear pattern of sleep disturbances, anxiety, and what he termed nervous afflictions among couples who had acquired the trader's goods. The doctor's systematic approach revealed correlations that might have been missed through casual observation. Families who had acquired larger quantities of Whitmore's hides showed more severe symptoms, and those who used the hides for bedding or clothing experienced effects more quickly than those who used them for decorative purposes. Duration of exposure also appeared to be a factor, with symptoms intensifying over time rather than diminishing. Dr. Thorne's medical records from this period document the progression of symptoms among affected community members. Initial effects included mild sleep disruption and occasional vivid dreams. These progressed to more severe insomnia accompanied by what patients described as waking dreams that occurred during periods of apparent consciousness. Advanced symptoms included reports of auditory phenomena and compelling urges to visit specific locations during nighttime hours. The doctor's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to test his hypothesis by purchasing one of Whitmore's newer acquisitions, a remarkably soft hide that the trader claimed came from a young deer. Dr. Thorne placed the hide in his own bedroom as a wall covering and documented his subsequent experiences in his medical journal. First night, no unusual occurrences. Sleep normal, though perhaps deeper than typical. Dreams more vivid than usual, but not disturbing in nature. Awakened feeling unusually refreshed despite the standard 7 hours of rest. Second night, vivid dreams of being in locations I have never visited, characterized by unusual geological formations and plant life. The dreams possessed a clarity that made them seem more like memories than imagination. Particularly notable was the consistent appearance of underground chambers carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. Third night, awakened at approximately 3:30 a.m. by what I can only describe as whispering. The sound seemed to emanate from the hide itself, though careful examination revealed no visible source. The whispers used words in no language I recognize, yet somehow conveyed meaning that suggested invitation or instruction. Upon investigation, I found nothing. Yet the sensation persisted until dawn. Dr. Thorne's documentation continued for 2 weeks, each entry describing increasingly disturbing experiences. By the 7th night, he reported feeling as though he was not alone in his cabin despite living by himself. He described an overwhelming sense of being observed and noted that his medical instruments, normally arranged in precise order, were frequently found in different positions each morning. The doctor's scientific training led him to consider various explanations for his experiences. He tested for gas leaks, chemical contamination, and other environmental factors that might cause hallucinations or disorientation. His systematic elimination of conventional causes forced him to consider possibilities that challenged his materialistic worldview. The investigation reached its culmination when Dr. Thorne decided to examine the hide more thoroughly using his surgical instruments. What he discovered challenged his understanding of natural history and biological processes. Hidden beneath the outer fur layer, he found what appeared to be deliberate markings carved or burned into the flesh before the hide had been cured. These markings formed patterns that resembled no Native American designs he had encountered during his years in Colorado, yet possessed a geometric complexity that suggested intelligent creation. The patterns seemed to follow mathematical principles that created optical effects when viewed under lamplight, appearing to shift and move despite being carved into static material. Most disturbing was Dr. Thorne's discovery that the hide appeared to be composed of sections from multiple animals, expertly joined together in a way that was nearly invisible to casual inspection. The seams, where different pieces met, had been disguised using techniques that required considerable knowledge of hide processing and anatomical structures. The implications of this finding troubled Dr. Thorne deeply, as it suggested that Whitmore was not simply trading in unusual hides, but was actively modifying them in ways that served some unknown purpose. The level of skill required for such modifications indicated professional training or extensive experience that seemed inconsistent with frontier trading operations. Father Ashford's own investigation followed a different path, focusing on the spiritual and psychological effects he observed among his parishioners. He began conducting what he termed spiritual interviews, carefully questioning couples about their experiences without revealing his growing concerns about Whitmore's trade. The priest's theological training had prepared him to recognize signs of spiritual distress, but the symptoms displayed by affected parishioners didn't match traditional categories. Rather than showing evidence of demonic influence or religious crisis, they seemed to be responding to some form of external communication that operated independently of their conscious awareness. Father Ashford's findings, documented in his personal correspondence, painted a picture of a community gradually falling under some form of influence. He noted that couples who had acquired Whitmore's hides displayed increased isolation, spending more time in their cabins and less time participating in community activities. Their behavior during church services became noticeably different, with affected individuals appearing distracted and unresponsive to familiar liturgical elements. Most concerning to Father Ashford was his observation that these couples gradually stopped attending church services altogether. When he visited their homes to check on their welfare, he found them reluctant to discuss their absence, offering vague explanations about feeling unwell or being too busy with household tasks. The priest's house-to-house visits revealed additional disturbing details about the affected families' changing behavior patterns. They had begun modifying their daily routines to accommodate activities that they couldn't clearly explain. Couples reported spending hours engaged in what they described as preparation work without being able to specify what they were preparing for. Adults in affected families displayed particularly troubling changes. Previously active and social individuals became withdrawn and secretive, spending long periods alone in their rooms or wandering near the edges of the settlement. When questioned about their activities, they provided answers that seemed rehearsed or coached, as though they had been instructed on appropriate responses. In March 1893, the situation reached a crisis point when the Henderson couple disappeared entirely from their cabin. John Henderson and his wife Martha had been among Whitmore's most frequent customers, having decorated their entire cabin with his hides and regularly purchasing additional items for trade with other families. The Henderson couple's disappearance occurred during a period of severe weather that should have made travel impossible. Snow had been falling continuously for 3 days, creating drifts that blocked most trails and made navigation extremely dangerous. The couple had been seen at the general store 2 days before their disappearance, purchasing supplies that suggested no intention of immediate travel. When neighbors noticed that no smoke had risen from their chimney for 3 days, Dr. Thorne and Father Ashford organized a search party. The severe weather conditions required careful planning and coordination to ensure the searchers' safety while conducting a thorough investigation of the Henderson property and surrounding area. The cabin was found in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained in their usual places. Food was fresh in the pantry, and the couple's horse and other livestock appeared well cared for. The beds had been slept in but were neatly made, suggesting that the disappearance had occurred after a normal night's rest. The only unusual detail was that all of Whitmore's hides had been removed from the walls, leaving behind cleaner patches on the log surfaces where they had hung. The hides themselves were nowhere to be found within the cabin, though careful searching revealed no obvious method by which they could have been removed without leaving traces in the snow around the building. A thorough search of the surrounding area revealed no tracks or signs of the couple's departure. The mountain snow should have preserved clear evidence of any movement. Yet, even Josiah Brennan's expert tracking skills found no trace of where the Hendersons might have gone. The absence of footprints or sled tracks in the fresh snow suggested that the couple had somehow departed without touching the ground around their cabin. The search party's investigation expanded to include the family's root cellar, a partially underground storage space used for preserving food through the winter months. The cellar's entrance had been carefully sealed with wooden planks and packed snow, as though someone had taken particular care to ensure it remained undisturbed. The discovery that most disturbed the search party was found when they removed the barrier and entered the root cellar. Hidden beneath several layers of preserved vegetables, they found a collection of the missing hides, but these had been altered in a way that defied explanation. The hides had been sewn together into what appeared to be crude garments sized for adult wear. Each garment bore the same geometric markings that Dr. Thorne had discovered on his specimen, but carved much more deeply and filled with what appeared to be dried blood. The workmanship showed considerable skill, with seams that had been reinforced and finished using techniques that seemed to combine traditional hide working methods with innovations that served unknown purposes. The garments varied in size and design, suggesting they had been created for specific individuals rather than mass production. Measurements indicated they would fit the Henderson couple, though certain modifications suggested they were intended for use under conditions quite different from normal mountain weather. Father Ashford immediately declared the cabin and its contents to be spiritually contaminated, refusing to allow anyone to handle the altered hides. His reaction was based not on superstition but on careful observation of the psychological effects that contact with similar materials had produced in other community members. The priest organized a group of men to burn the entire contents of the root cellar. But the destruction proved more difficult than expected. The hides seemed to resist combustion, requiring multiple attempts and unusual amounts of fuel to destroy completely. When flames finally took hold, they produced an unusual blue color and an acrid smoke that caused severe respiratory distress among the destruction party. Most disturbing was the observation that the smoke seemed to form patterns in the air, resembling the geometric designs they had found carved throughout Whitmore's operation. The patterns appeared to have structure and meaning, as though the burning materials were attempting to communicate some final message before their destruction. The Henderson couple's disappearance galvanized the community's opposition to Whitmore's presence. A town meeting was called, and by unanimous decision, the traitor was banned from entering the settlement. Several armed men were assigned to patrol the valley's entrances with orders to turn Whitmore away should he attempt to return. However, Whitmore's reaction to this banishment proved as unsettling as his original presence. Rather than protesting or attempting negotiation, he simply smiled when informed of the decision and replied, "The arrangement has served its purpose. Your people have been prepared for the next phase." The traitor's calm acceptance of banishment suggested that the community's decision aligned with his own plans rather than disrupting them. His reference to the next phase implied that his trading operation had been merely preparatory for some larger objective that no longer required his direct presence in the valley. He then loaded his pack horse and departed toward Dead Horse Canyon, but not before leaving a final statement: "Those who have worn the gifts will understand their obligation when the time comes." The phrase "worn the gift" seemed to reference the garments found in the Henderson root cellar, suggesting that similar preparations had been made throughout the community. The meaning of Whitmore's parting words became apparent over the following weeks. Several couples who had purchased his hides began exhibiting increasingly strange behavior. They started leaving their cabins at night, walking in groups toward Dead Horse Canyon despite the continued harsh weather and dangerous conditions. These nocturnal processions were witnessed by various residents who described the participants as moving with unusual purpose and apparent indifference to the cold. The walkers traveled in pairs, following paths that seemed to require no conscious navigation, despite the darkness and snow-covered terrain. Dr. Thorne attempted to intercept one of these groups, consisting of 3 couples who had been among Whitmore's best customers. When he approached them, they acknowledged his presence but seemed unable to explain their behavior. They claimed to be following instructions they had received in dreams, though they could not articulate the nature or source of these instructions. Their eyes, Dr. Thorne wrote in his journal, possessed a quality I had never before observed in living humans. They appeared alert and intelligent, yet somehow distant, as though the individuals I was addressing were observing me from some great remove. When I asked where they were going, they pointed toward the canyon and said they had been called together. The phrase seemed rehearsed, as though they had been coached on appropriate responses to interference. The doctor's attempts to physically prevent the group from continuing their journey proved futile. While they did not resist or become hostile, they demonstrated a determination that bordered on the supernatural. Despite Dr. Thorne's blocking their path and his appeals to their reason, they simply walked around him and continued toward their destination. The walkers' apparent immunity to persuasion or physical interference suggested that whatever compelled their behavior operated at a level beyond conscious control. They seemed driven by an imperative that overrode normal human responses to authority, social pressure, or personal relationships. Father Ashford organized a larger intervention, gathering all the remaining community members to prevent what he feared might be additional disappearances. However, when the rescue party reached Dead Horse Canyon the following morning, they found no trace of the missing couples. The canyon showed no evidence of human presence despite the fresh snow that should have preserved clear tracks. The search party conducted a systematic examination of every accessible area within the canyon, finding no footprints, campfire remains, or other signs that would indicate where the missing couples might have gone. Most disturbing was their discovery of Whitmore's abandoned trading post. The cabin appeared to have been vacant for months rather than the few days since his departure. Dust covered all surfaces. The fireplace contained only cold ashes, and the structure itself seemed to be deteriorating at an accelerated rate. The rapid decay of Whitmore's cabin suggested that his presence had somehow maintained the building's integrity through unnatural means. Without his influence, the structure was reverting to a condition more consistent with years of abandonment rather than recent occupation. When Dr. Thorne examined the building more closely, he found that the wooden walls had been carved with the same geometric patterns they had discovered on the modified hides. However, these carvings appeared to be much older than Whitmore's recent residence, suggesting that the patterns had been present before his arrival, or that his modifications had somehow accelerated aging in the surrounding materials. Inside the cabin, the search party found evidence of Whitmore's true activities. Hanging from the rafters were dozens of partially completed hide garments, each crafted with meticulous attention to the same pattern they had seen in the Henderson cabin. The workmanship showed a level of skill and consistency that indicated long experience with such projects. Tools for hide preparation were arranged around a central work area, along with substances that Dr. Thorne could not identify but which emitted the same sweet, cloying odor that had characterized Whitmore's trade goods. Chemical analysis of these substances proved impossible with available equipment, but their properties suggested organic compounds that had been processed using techniques unknown to conventional tanning methods. Most shocking was the discovery of a detailed map painted on one wall, showing not only the Crestone Valley area but extending to mountain regions throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. Various locations were marked with symbols matching the geometric patterns, suggesting that Whitmore's operation extended far beyond their small community. The map revealed a network of locations that stretched across multiple territories, with connecting lines that seemed to indicate travel routes or communication pathways. Each marked location was annotated with symbols that appeared to represent different phases or types of activity, suggesting a coordinated operation involving multiple sites and personnel. Father Ashford's examination of the map revealed annotations in multiple languages, including what appeared to be Native American pictographs, Spanish colonial references, and symbols he could not identify. Several locations were marked with dates stretching back to the 1860s, indicating that Whitmore's activities had been ongoing for decades. The multilingual annotations suggested involvement by individuals from various cultural backgrounds, possibly including people with formal education in multiple academic disciplines. The complexity and scope of the documented operation far exceeded what frontier communities should have been able to organize or support. The priest's discovery of a collection of correspondence hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards provided additional insight into the scope of Whitmore's operations. Letters in various hands described similar hide trading activities in remote communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The correspondence referenced preparation phases, collection schedules, and harvest periods in language that suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple individuals. One letter dated 6 months before Whitmore's arrival in Crestone Valley contained particularly disturbing content. Written by someone identified only as M. Fletcher, it stated, "The Colorado specimens have shown remarkable adaptation rates. Subjects exposed to the prepared materials demonstrate the expected behavioral modifications within 3 to 4 weeks. Recommend proceeding to final phase during spring migration period when missing subjects.